you are naked. Not metaphorically, literally, physically naked. It is somewhere between 170,000 and 300,000 years ago, and you are standing at the edge of a forest in what will one day be called Europe. The wind is cutting into you. There are no walls, no blankets, no fire yet. Fire takes effort, and you haven't made one tonight. You are just skin, and the world is cold. And somewhere in the dark, a cave bear the size of a small car is sleeping 30 meters away. Here's the thing nobody tells you about that moment. You didn't survive it by being tough. You survived it because at some point one of your ancestors did something that sounds almost embarrassingly simple. They took the skin off that bear and they wrapped it around their body. And that single act, that almost laughably obvious solution, ended up being one of the most important decisions in the entire history of our species. Not just because it kept them warm, but because of what happened next. What clothing eventually made possible is something most people never think about. And when you find out, it changes the way you understand the word human. The obvious answer to why ancient humans started wearing clothes is warmth. You hear this and you nod along. Cold weather, animal skins, problem solved. It makes sense. It's clean. It's satisfying. But there's a problem with that story. Archaeologist Ian Gilligan of the University of Sydney has spent decades studying prehistoric clothing, and his research reveals something that upends the tidy warmth-first narrative. Humans lost their body hair approximately 1 million years ago. That is not a typo. 1 million years ago, our ancestors became essentially naked apes. And for the next 800,000 years or so, they somehow survived without clothing in any recognizable form. They had no fur, they had no clothes, and they lived through multiple ice ages. So the question isn't just why did humans start wearing clothes? The question is, why did it take us so long? The oldest direct evidence of clothing comes from a site that has become one of the most important archaeological locations in the world, Schöningen, a town in Lower Saxony, Germany. This is the place where researchers found 9 throwing spears from 300,000 years ago, the oldest wooden hunting weapons ever discovered. And in 2023, doctoral researcher Ivo Verheijen of the University of Tübingen published a study in the Journal of Human Evolution that added something remarkable to the Schöningen record: cut marks on the paw bones of a cave bear. Now, cut marks on bones usually mean one thing: butchering for meat. But Verheijen pointed out something crucial. There is almost no meat on bear paw bones. The hand and foot bones of an animal are wrapped in skin that lies very close to the skeleton, which means the only reason to cut there, carefully, precisely, is to remove the hide intact. The people at Schöningen weren't eating the bear's paws. They were skinning it. Cave bears were enormous. Think polar bear, but bigger. Their coats had a double structure: long outer hairs that formed a protective layer against wind and moisture, and a dense inner layer of short hairs for insulation. Verheijen noted that these hides were only usable if stripped within a day of the animal's death, which means whoever did the skinning had almost certainly hunted that bear, not scavenged it. The world's oldest spears and the world's earliest evidence of clothing found at the exact same site. The clothing they made was probably simple: a hide draped over the shoulders, wrapped around the torso, held in place by grip and tension, not tailored, not fitted, more like a living blanket than a jacket. But it worked. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange, because 130,000 years later, the evidence suggests humans were still doing basically the same thing, the same draped hide approach, almost no innovation for over 100,000 years. Then, roughly 170,000 years ago, something shifted, and the evidence for this shift comes from an animal most people have never thought about in this context: lice. Biologist David Reed of the Florida Museum of Natural History studied the DNA of human body lice and compared it to the DNA of head lice. Body lice, unlike head lice, cannot survive without fabric. They live in clothing, not on skin. They die within hours if removed from cloth. So when body lice first diverged genetically from head lice, when they first became a separate population adapted to living in garments, that tells us almost exactly when humans started wearing clothes regularly enough to provide a stable habitat for these parasites. Reed's analysis, published in Molecular Biology and Evolution, put that divergence at approximately 170,000 years ago, 70,000 years before modern humans began migrating out of Africa into colder climates. Reed himself found this surprising. As he told journalists at the time, humans were apparently experimenting with clothing long before they desperately needed it for cold weather survival. The clothing came first. The cold weather migration followed. But here is the part that stops you cold when you think about it carefully. Something happened between 300,000 years ago and 40,000 years ago that wasn't just about staying warm, because at around 40,000 years ago, in a burst of activity that researchers are still trying to fully understand, something transformed the nature of clothing completely. And the object at the center of this transformation is almost insultingly small: a needle. A bone needle, to be precise. Thin, carefully shaped, with a tiny hole at one end for threading sinew or plant fiber. The oldest eyed needles appear in Siberia approximately 40,000 years ago, in the Caucasus around 38,000 years ago, and in Western Europe around 26,000 years ago, according to a 2024 analysis published in Science Advances led by Ian Gilligan. This tiny invention changed everything. Before the eyed needle, clothing was draped. After the eyed needle, clothing was built. You could sew separate pieces together. You could fit a garment to the curves of a specific body. You could create a sealed system, a layer of trapped warm air that a draped hide simply cannot produce. Gilligan's research showed that fitted, sewn clothing doesn't just keep you warmer than a draped skin. It can be up to 5 times more thermally effective per kilogram of material. The same amount of animal hide that kept someone barely alive became enough to survive genuine Arctic conditions. And then, here is the twist that most people miss entirely. When the last ice age ended and the climate warmed again, Gilligan argues that this clothing revolution sparked something that shaped everything about how you live today. As temperatures rose, humans needed lighter, more breathable fabrics. Skins and furs were too hot. They turned to plant fibers. Weaving plant fibers into cloth requires a completely different technology. It requires agriculture to produce fibers reliably and at scale. Gilligan's argument, laid out in his 2019 book Climate, Clothing, and Agriculture in Prehistory, is that the need for woven textile fibers was one of the key pressures driving the invention of farming. Clothing didn't just follow the agricultural revolution. It may have helped cause it. Think about what that actually means. Every piece of clothing you own, every factory that makes it, the entire global textile industry, the very concept of fashion. It traces back to a moment when a human being in Germany pressed a stone blade against the paw of a dead cave bear and started carefully peeling back the skin. There's a moment in most people's day, getting dressed in the morning, pulling a shirt over your head, that feels like the most ordinary thing imaginable. You barely notice it, but that gesture is ancient beyond comprehension. The need it answers is the same need that sent our ancestors hunting cave bears 300,000 years ago. The same need that made a bone needle the most transformative piece of technology of the Paleolithic. The same need that, if you follow Ian Gilligan's argument to its conclusion, set in motion the chain of events that led to agriculture, civilization, and the world as you know it. You started wearing clothes to stay warm, but staying warm required tools, and tools required skill, and skill created culture, and culture built everything else. Disclaimer: this video discusses anthropological and archaeological research for educational purposes. Modern hunter-gatherer observations are used as comparative models to understand ancient human behavior, not as definitive proof of how all ancient humans lived across different time periods and geographies.